In 1974, the Australian men's national team qualified for the FIFA World Cup for the very first time. It was a watershed moment for the sport down under, with a bunch of part-timers taking on the likes of hosts and would-be champions West Germany, East Germany and Chile in the group stage. While the Socceroos failed to win a game or score a goal, the sport enjoyed an unheralded amount of exposure back home. Participation rates and media exposure shot up overnight, according to Australian football legend Johnny Warren. The team was now prominent back page sports news in Australia for a couple of weeks and even made the front page of the newspapers on occasion, he said in his 2002 biography Sheilas, Wogs and Afters. Most of the players became household names back in Australia, giving young soccer players someone to admire and emulate. But the big thing that stuck out for Warren was the lack of a national competition. The likes of West Germany, East Germany, Chile and all the other nations at the 1974 World Cup had their own national leagues or cups. The original Australia Cup, which ran from 1962 to 1968, was the closest Australia had ever gotten to a national competition in any sport. Across the competition's lifespan of 7 seasons, at least one club from each state and territory, bar the Northern Territory, was represented in the old Australia Cup. In the end, the competition folded due to the difficulties and costs of interstate travel. But a National League was first proposed well before the Socceroos' foray into the World Cup in 1974, coming as far back as 1964. The then Australian Soccer Federation had plans for a league consisting of 12 full-time professional clubs. 3 would be based in Sydney, 3 in Melbourne, 1 in each of Adelaide, Brisbane, Newcastle and Wollongong. Each club would have a minimum of board directors of 12, would have to contribute £100, full-time professional staff and 16 apprentices, together with a full-time coach. The headquarters of this league would be at, well, you guessed it, Sydney. The Sydney bias is still showing, even 60 years ago, hey. Throughout the year, costs had blown out to £40,000 a season, according to Hakoah President Dr. Maury Pazanic. That's over $600,000 in today's money. Dr. Pazanic said he couldn't, quote, see any club finding that sort of money, and called the league a, quote, economic impossibility for 1964, or 1966 for that matter, end quote. He called on officials to make sensible long-term plans for the eventual formation of a national league, but he didn't seem like he was a big fan of it. Does that kind of remind you of someone? Melbourne Knights. Oh, sorry, said something in my throat there. There was even talks of a 2-state national league in 1969. It's not really national when you've only got 2 states, but you could imagine the 2 states that wanted to start up this comp. Yep. Tasmania and Western Australia. No, I'm joking. It was Victoria and New South Wales. Their proposition had the potential to fall into an absolute disaster when the leftover clubs and states threatened to break away and start their own competition. But the success of the Socceroos in making that 1974 World Cup finally made a national league a real possibility for the first time. At the time, state leagues were becoming increasingly predictable as the bigger clubs began to dominate the competition. Attendances, rather than growing after the World Cup, were actually dropping in 1975 because long-standing supporters were quite literally dying out and not being replaced by a new era of fans. The competition at the state level was in a desperate need of an overhaul. Cue Alex Pongrass at St George and Frank Lowy at Hakoah. They were the true pioneers of what would become what we know as the National Soccer League today. But it wasn't going to be easy because, frankly, pardon the pun, nothing like this had been done before in Australia. The Australia Cup, like we said before, was a simple knockout competition that barely lasted 7 seasons and didn't even feature a home and away season. The NBL didn't tip off until 1979. The then VFL, the country's premier Australian rules football competition, didn't even get a team from outside Victoria until 1980, after South Melbourne relocated to Sydney to become the Swans. And they didn't even expand further until 1987 into Perth and Brisbane. The New South Wales Rugby League, the precursor to the NRL, was a 12-team Sydney-based competition at the time. It had only added teams from Canberra and Wollongong in 1982, before expanding beyond its borders north to Brisbane and Gold Coast in 1988. So in April 1975, delegates from 9 clubs from Sydney, Newcastle, Brisbane and Adelaide met in the New South Wales capital. The meeting was chaired by Alex Pongrass, the then president of St George, and he described it as a historic occasion for football in Australia. But the biggest test the National League faced was politics. If you've been around Australian football for, 5-10 minutes, you know how much politics plays a part in this sport. State federations can be prickly and stubborn, and that was exactly the case in the establishment of the National League. These state federations were fearful of losing their biggest clubs and in turn their biggest source of revenue. While it's Queensland at the moment, as Football Australia looks to start up a national second tier, it was Victoria back then. At that meeting in 1975, there were no Victorian clubs represented. South Melbourne, Footscray, Juventus and George Cross, the leading clubs from Melbourne at the time, did not attend because of a, quote, change in attitude from the Victorian Soccer Federation. But Pondgrass said he was happy to go ahead without the Victorian clubs. The 9 foundation clubs were meant to be Ipia Leichhardt, Marconi, Western Suburbs, St George, Hakoah, Adamstown from Newcastle, the Brisbane Lions, West Adelaide and Adelaide City. All member clubs had to lodge a deposit of $5,000 with a further $5,000 to $10,000 to be lodged at a later date. Fair bit of money at the time for those clubs, hey? But no Victorian clubs meant the league would suffer a huge blow. One of the biggest markets for the sport in Australia, a national league just wouldn't feel right without clubs from Melbourne. But it was little-known Morellabark from Melbourne's outer eastern suburbs that broke the deadlock between the Victorian Soccer Federation and the National League, as they signed up and in turn brought 3 other Victorian sides with them, being South Melbourne, Heidelberg and Footscray. After years of deliberating and fighting, the National Soccer League was a reality, set to kick off in 1977. And it scored a major win, with electronics company Philips coming on as the inaugural major sponsor, providing $450,000 each season for the first 3. The league would also have TV coverage, with programs appearing on Saturday and Sunday nights, featuring highlights of the matches. The founding clubs for the inaugural season were Marconi, St George, Hakoah, Sydney Olympic, Western Suburbs, Heidelberg, Footscray, Morellabark, South Melbourne, Adelaide City, West Adelaide, Brisbane City, Brisbane Lions and the newly created Canberra City. Newcastle, who had hoped to be a part of the inaugural season, missed out, but would ultimately join a year later via Newcastle KB United. It all kicked off on April 2, 1977, as Canberra City hosted West Adelaide at Manuka Oval in the nation's capital. It was a historic match, over a decade in the making, with a crowd of 1,700 eager fans watching on. Socceroos star John Kosmina had the honours of scoring the NSL's first ever goal in the 7th minute of the match. More than 30,000 people attended the 7 games in 5 major cities on the opening round, with the best attended one at the Old Middle Park in Melbourne, as 7,460 fans saw Hakoah down Heidelberg 3-1. There was no grand final that year, with the championship going to Hakoah, who finished the regular season in first place. They actually tied with Marconi on 37 points, but Hakoah had a better goal difference, enough to claim the inaugural NSL title. The grand final wouldn't be staged until 1984, but it quickly developed into the biggest match on the Australian football calendar. That concludes our first video looking at one story in the big history of Australian football. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this video. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, and I sure hope you did. Now let me know what you'd like to hear about next in the comments, and please do consider subscribing to the channel. It helps a ton. Cheers.